Welcome to Noon Wednesday. I'm Marissa Wojcik, multimedia journalist with Here and Now on PBS Wisconsin. Today is September 22. For many reasons, 2020 is going to have a lasting impact, and one of those is the presidential election. A recent survey asked clerks and voters about their experiences of the 2020 election, and joining me to tell us about that survey and the results is Barry Burden, a UW-Madison professor of political science and director of the Elections Research Center. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
First, with voters, was there consensus from voters on how they experienced the 2020 election? And did any groups report particular difficulty voting?
Yeah, so the report is based on surveys of both the public and local election officials. And the public gave the election really high marks. I asked them specifically in the survey whether they encountered difficulty, especially with the shift to absentee voting, which was new for a lot of voters. The vast majority of voters in Wisconsin said it was an easy process. They were happy with how the election operated. For those who voted in person, most had very short waiting times. That's been the tradition in Wisconsin, and it held in 2020. And so I think the broad message is one of great success, despite all of the difficulties and the very high levels of turnout, the shifts that had to happen to move polling places from old locations to new locations. Voters mostly had good experiences. But there were some pockets in the population that continued to have difficulty, and maybe more difficulty in 2020 than in other years. In particular, three jump out. Those are young people, people with disabilities, and non-white minority voters. All three of those groups were more likely in the survey to say that they had some difficulty with the absentee voting process, either getting a witness signature or getting the ballot in on time or making the request. They had some difficulty voting in person. The wait times to vote were longer for young people, people with disabilities, and minority voters. And so this continued to be kind of trouble spots, and I think for different reasons. You know, young voters, especially college-age students, were often relocated or dislocated during the pandemic, moving maybe from a campus back to their parents' home or something else, and having to figure out the absentee voting process as a result of that. I think that understandably created some problems for them, and many more of them ended up voting in person, probably as a side effect of all that.
And shifting over to clerks, why was it difficult for you to summarize all of the experiences of municipal clerks, and what did they report as difficulty administering the election?
Well, Wisconsin has a somewhat unusual system of election administration. It's based at the municipal level. So every city, village, and town has its own election clerk, whether it's the city of Milwaukee with over 400,000 people, or it's a small town that might only have a few hundred people. In fact, the typical clerk serves less than 1,000 voters. So it's very decentralized, and there's a huge range in the kind of professionalism and capacity of these offices and the number of voters they serve. Most clerks work part-time on an hourly basis. Most of them have other jobs on the side. So it's a part-time gig, as opposed to clerks in, say, Green Bay or Madison who have staffs and work year-round and really focus on elections. And so you get a wide variety of opinions about what election practices ought to be adopted, depending on the size of the community and what the experience was. Again, most clerks had a really successful election. They were happy with how things came off. They innovated in some really interesting ways to make things work when they had difficulty finding poll workers or having to shift to new locations. Especially in bigger cities, there were innovations like the use of drop boxes to collect ballots. In some places, using old storefronts from closed businesses as polling locations because they allowed for social distancing. But you see in the survey that the general attitude towards voting and the administration of elections is pretty different in small towns and villages compared to bigger cities. For example, whether we ought to allow something like drop boxes or even mandate that municipalities use drop boxes. Bigger cities were really enthusiastic about that. They'd like to certainly allow the option, if not mandate, that there's some number of drop boxes. But in the smallest communities, I think they have difficulty imagining serving drop boxes while doing the other things they're doing election-wise before election day. And so they really resist the idea of a mandate. But even kind of the routine aspects of running an election, like recruiting poll workers was equally difficult in big cities and small towns, but in bigger communities, more of those poll workers were new. In larger cities, about half of the poll workers were brand new, had never served before. So they need to be trained. They need to be found and trained and recruited and probably monitored in a way that ongoing poll workers wouldn't be. And yet clerks told us those new poll workers did just as well, if not better, than their veteran poll workers who returned. So there's a silver lining to all of that, but it does present special challenges, I think, in larger cities than in some smaller communities.
And some clerks reported high levels of burnout with the pandemic and the political environment, in some cases experiencing threats. Because of those experiences, are we going to see any sort of mass exodus of municipal clerks, especially with that good experience of knowing how to administer elections? And what would be the consequences of that if we lost that institutional knowledge?
Yeah, there have been news stories from other parts of the country about election officials getting out of the job, that 2020 was just so difficult and unpleasant, they've decided to hang it up and retire. And so I was concerned that that would happen in Wisconsin as well. The survey did ask about some of the specific experiences that clerks had with hostile or threatening messages. And about 20% of clerks told us that those were more common experiences in 2020 than before. So that's obviously a stress on the job. The survey asked specifically about burnout, about whether they feel used up at the end of the workday. And the vast majority of clerks said, absolutely. It's a very difficult job, especially during the pandemic. We also ask about other stresses, misinformation, having to combat either intentional or unintentional misunderstandings about how the election operates, just put new pressure on them to try to keep the facts in front of voters and run a proper election. And then, of course, the glut of absentee ballots, the ballots arriving by the mail that they really didn't have to process in the past and don't have the ability to process before Election Day under Wisconsin law. That was a real trouble, I think, for a lot of clerks to, as those ballots began to pile up before the election, to then have to process them all on Election Day. So the survey asked specifically whether all of those experiences together made the clerk more likely to want to end their career in that position, or it didn't make much of a difference, or it might actually make them more likely to stay. And I was surprised to see that there was a sort of equal balance. About 20% of clerks said that the experience made them more likely to want to leave. Some of them said they were going to retire early as a result. But there was another 20% that indicated that the experience made them rededicate themselves to their positions, and they really wanted to stay on, and they were now more likely to serve for additional elections than they would have been. So that's a wonderful kind of bright side, I think, again, silver lining to all of this that doesn't get emphasized as much. In looking at the actual rosters of clerks from before the election and after, the turnover does not seem to be exceptional at this point. There's always a churn in these positions. As I said, they're part-time. They're not careers for many of these people. And so they do sort of cycle in and cycle out. But it looks like the pattern is really not much higher in terms of the turnover this time around than it would have been after the 2016 election.
And you mentioned absentee ballots. How much did that play a role in the 2020 election overall? There were unprecedented numbers of voting by mail. Did this impact voters? Did this impact clerks? And you mentioned how different municipalities, different counties, cities, villages, vastly different sizes, dealing with vastly different levels of population. Did that have varying impacts on how absentee ballots were processed and eventually counted?
It did. It was probably the first election in Wisconsin history where the majority of votes were cast outside of Election Day. The normal pattern in Wisconsin, the system, is really set up to serve voters on Election Day with a small number of voters expected to cast ballots by mail or maybe in person early, which we call early voting, but is really a form of absentee voting in Wisconsin. But 2020 turned that on its head, and it was only a minority of voters who cast votes in person. So I think one thing that's done is really set up future elections in Wisconsin to always have these three pieces simultaneously: voting in person on Election Day, which we all recognize, that's the traditional way of voting; voting by mail, where a voter requests the ballot and then sends it in through the Postal Service; and then this third form, which is absentee voting in person of some kind before Election Day. And that's where clerks really did a lot of their innovating I mentioned the use of drop boxes before. Those got rolled out in lots of communities, but especially in bigger communities, and they were heavily used by voters. I think many voters viewed the drop boxes as more secure than the mail. There were some concerns about whether the Postal Service could meet its delivery standards in 2020. And people were just worried about that ballot getting back on time. And so I think there was a kind of security in using the drop box for a lot of voters. So that was a massive innovation. But there were others. Cities like Madison used drop slots at libraries that would normally be used for returning books as a way to collect ballots. There were ballot collection activities in parks and other places where election workers would go out and receive those ballots. Again, taking the Postal Service out of that final step of getting the ballot back to the election office, I think it was a sense of security for a lot of voters. But it did really put pressure on election officials, as I was saying, to see those ballots piling up before Election Day. They need to be stored somewhere that's secure and then allocated to the right polling place on Election Day where they are opened, inspected, and tabulated. And so that was additional work for poll workers on Election Day to be doing an excessive amount of absentee ballot tabulation alongside in-person voting. Now, there's another innovation that was underway before 2020 in some, mostly larger communities, and that is counting absentee ballots at a central location instead of at the polling place. Cities like Brookfield and Milwaukee and I think Green Bay had already been doing this as just a kind of efficiency. Huge number of ballots need to be processed, and instead of sorting them out to the polling places, just take them to the one place, use a high-speed scanner to run those ballots. More communities were interested in doing that in 2020, and in the survey, many clerks said they're thinking seriously about doing this in upcoming elections. So I think we'll be going from, a couple dozen who had been doing it before the election to probably many dozens, especially larger communities in future elections.
And now that everything is more virtual, some of us remember seeing video of these massive rooms in Milwaukee, for example, of people counting ballots. Very, very interesting time. So switching gears a little bit, no voter fraud has been found, and we are still talking about the 2020 election in September, late September of 2021. There are several ongoing investigations in our state alone. Assembly Speaker Robin Vos says he just wants to show the public that they can trust how elections are run in Wisconsin. Are these investigations eroding or gaining public trust?
Well, that's a really good question, and I'm going to answer it in a moment. But let me just say that the message from my survey of clerks and voters, the two major stakeholders in the election, was that it was highly successful. They're very confident in what happened. They had a good experience, despite all the difficulties, despite the public health concerns, financial concerns, misinformation, the change in the way people voted. They pulled it off. And I think we want to keep going back to that theme because it is the dominant experience of both the election officials and the voters. Really nowhere in my surveys did I hear from clerks that they thought there was substantial fraud happening or that they thought the laws were not being implemented properly. There were opportunities in the survey for them to say whatever they wanted. In addition to the closed-ended questions I asked, there were lots of opportunities for open-ended verbatim comments. And it was rare for a clerk to say anything about the security of the election or the integrity of the election that bothered them. Now, in terms of whether these investigations and audits and other things that are underway are going to boost confidence, I think it's unlikely. We know from surveys of voters around the country that the major predictor of whether they are confident about an election is if they hear from people in their party in particular, public officials, candidates, other leaders, that telling them they should have confidence in the election. That's the kind of credible source they would hear from in politics that's going to be meaningful to them. Most voters are saying in the survey they had a great experience. And they don't really have any qualms about how the election was conducted. But if you're hearing from someone in public life telling you that even though your experience was fine, elsewhere we have suspicions or we think there are irregularities, as a voter, you don't have a lot of ammunition to combat those kinds of concerns. And so I think one of the best things we can do is simply remind voters that the election had both the normal testing of equipment that happens before the election and after, where it's publicly run and everyone can see that the machines are working properly. There's a spot audit of the state that happens after every election where random wards around the state are selected and the ballots are reviewed. And then there was a full recount of all the ballots in the two biggest counties in Wisconsin, Milwaukee and Dane. The Trump campaign paid for those, and they essentially verified the result with a small number of additional votes turned up for both sides. But really the basic outcome unchanged as a result of those reviews. So I think by continuing to raise questions and demand investigations and other kinds of things happen 9 months, 10 months after the election, it's likely to lower confidence, or certainly not to boost it. It may have some value, but I think the timing, the kind of partisanship that's embedded in it are really not helpful for reminding voters about all the good things that happened in the election.
And just drilling down a little bit further, Voss's investigation is led by former Wisconsin Supreme Court Justice Mike Gableman. And this week he released a 6-minute long video and talked about the fact that they're not challenging the results, but, quote, some election officials acted unilaterally in deciding not to follow established state law. What is your take on that? This is an investigation that seems to be different than looking for fraud. Is this just creating more confusion? Certainly, we haven't seen something like this before.
Well, I have a couple of worries about this. One is the Gableman investigation seems to have a moving target in mind. The kinds of things that his team is interested in have shifted over time. He's traveled to Arizona to see the recount audit business that was happening there in Maricopa County. He's traveled to a seminar that Mike Lindell, the MyPillow CEO, put on in South Dakota, and he's consulted with other folks who are in kind of that industry of raising questions about the election. His most recent video, as you mentioned, is now talking about clerks not following the law. And to me, that seems like a very different set of concerns. If that were happening, I think the legislature would have the right to hold hearings to look into that, and they've already done some of that. There could be court cases filed. Someone could file suit claiming that clerks or election officials were not following the law. Viewers will remember that there were 7 or 8 of those suits filed right after the presidential election in Wisconsin, both in state court and federal court, claiming that laws were not being followed, that the collection of ballots in city parks was not allowed under the law. Maybe drop boxes shouldn't have been permitted. Maybe clerks were assisting voters with completing absentee ballot information that they shouldn't have. All of those suits essentially were tossed out. They were not seen as having any merit, and they didn't make any changes to the election as a result. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't do some improvements after each election. It is an imperfect process. It's a very human process. We went through a really different kind of election than ever before, and I think the system adapted, but it wasn't designed to deal with the kind of challenges we faced in 2020. So some changes to the election law are probably right. But I don't think that doing it through a somewhat secretive investigation that's not done in full public view and with moving targets is really problematic.
Did clerks in your survey have a consensus or an idea of what kind of changes could be proposed in order to make elections run better or what they think would be fairer?
Yeah, so there is a tendency among election officials to like things the way they are. We call this a status quo bias. That one of the things that came out again and again in the survey is clerks just wanted the rules to be fixed. They don't want changes being made, especially during the election season. They were really frustrated in the spring during the presidential primary when the legislature or the governor or the courts were intervening and changing the rules on them. It forces them to re-educate voters, to retrain poll workers, to change the forms, then the informational materials they're using, to change all their processes. And they would like those things really to be locked down once we get into election season, which is completely understandable. It also means they mostly like the procedures that are in place. So for example, one of the questions in the survey asked clerks whether they think the deadline for returning absentee ballots should remain on election day. Right now, absentee ballots have to be brought back to the clerk in one form or another by mail or in person by the time polls close at 8 p.m. on election day. That practice got extended by a court back in the April presidential primary, so ballots could come in for another 6 days. And up until about 5 years ago, the state law actually allowed absentee ballots to trickle in up until Friday after Election Day, as long as they were postmarked by Election Day. To my surprise, clerks were nearly unanimous in saying, we absolutely think the Election Day deadline should hold. We don't want to extend it. Doesn't matter whether the clerk leans Democratic or leans Republican, is from a big city, a small town. That was a pretty common view. Let's keep things as they are. And that was true also with the deadline for requesting absentee ballots and a variety of other state laws. Clerks would really like to keep those things as they are. Where you start to see differences among clerks are in the sorts of things that would allow or prevent innovation, allow them to do things at the local level to serve their voters. So the use of drop boxes, I mentioned already. Some clerks are really resistant to that idea, but others would like either to allow it or mandate it. One of the other questions in the survey was about the processing of absentee ballots before Election Day. I mentioned already Wisconsin's one of the few states that doesn't allow clerks to start to work through that paperwork in advance, and it leads to some late nights and a lot of stress on election night. There were a couple proposals offered in the survey. One was, should election workers be allowed to at least open the absentee ballots before Election Day, inspect them, make sure everything is okay, they're not damaged, flatten them so they can be fed into the tabulators on Election Day. Some clerks were okay with that idea. There was another proposal which would have allowed actually the ballots to be inserted into the tabulating machines before Election Day. Maybe even allowing voters, if they come in person with the absentee ballot, to just put it into the machine. Several of the clerks said they thought that would be a rewarding experience for the voters to see it going into the machine, and would give them a sense of confidence that it had been received properly. Both of those things were supported by clerks from big cities and larger communities, bigger villages, but in smaller, less populous areas, clerks were really resistant. I think for many of them, it's difficult to imagine having the capacity to allow those kinds of things because they have such limited staffs, because they're working part-time. Some of them don't even have offices or official government phones they can use to do business. And they work, if they work out of their kitchen or living room coffee tables or something else, allowing multiple days of early voting or drop boxes or other things just seem somewhat unimaginable. So one conclusion in the report is that state policymakers need to think about simultaneously, on the one hand, having a uniform set of laws for the state. We certainly need to have a common deadline for all absentee ballots. That makes a lot of sense. But also giving room for clerks who have the resources or the interest or the need or the demand from their voters to serve them in different ways, by allowing early tabulation of votes, by allowing drop boxes or other kinds of things. And right now, I think policymakers aren't in that mindset yet of how to balance the uniformity on the things we need while allowing for the innovation for the clerks who are interested and able to do it.
And as you mentioned, 1,800 municipalities and running things slightly differently. That decentralization, the Wisconsin Elections Commission has repeatedly said that also helps Wisconsin's election integrity. When it comes to education, I think a lot of us learned about the election process last year more than ever before. It can sometimes be seen as a very dry process. But now that there is such a laser focus on trust, is more education around how this process actually works needed in order to ensure greater confidence in the system?
Yes, I think so. And that's a real lesson that election officials around the country have learned during the 2020 cycle, that trying to get in front of misinformation or disinformation campaigns is really essential. Not just giving that information to reporters who can then share it with the public, but to communicate with the public directly in some ways that maybe they have not in the past. Whether it's streaming live on Facebook, giving tours of election facilities, showing the counting of ballots, issuing informational guidance before the election. Now, Wisconsin clerks did a lot of that, and so did the Elections Commission before the election. For example, one of the bits of misinformation that people were concerned about was the late counting of ballots in Milwaukee. Milwaukee is the biggest city in the state. It receives a lot of absentee ballots. They are not permitted to do anything with those ballots before Election Day, so the counting begins on election morning alongside the other ballots. Milwaukee has a history of not finishing that until late at night. That was true back in 2018 in the governor's race. If everyone remembers those ballots coming in around midnight, we all knew that was going to be the case in 2020, probably later at night. So there was an advisory put out by the Elections Commission in advance to say, just be prepared. Those ballots are going to come in as a batch in Milwaukee. It might be a six-figure number. It'll be a lot of ballots. Nothing suspicious about it. It's just when the city finishes its central count of those absentee ballots. Despite those warnings, despite the experience of the state actually seeing that happen in prior elections, a surprising number of respondents in my survey said that they thought there was something suspicious about that. So that's, I think, a sign that public education is not fully working. I did ask clerks in the survey whether they were interested in doing more public education. Would they like to put more staff or more resources, more time into doing it? I was surprised that many clerks said no. They were quite content with the amount of public education they were doing. Some were interested in doing less, in fact. And that too varied by the size of the community. In bigger cities, clerks wanted to do more public education. They wish they had more time and more money to get out there and educate voters. I think some of that is the necessity in bigger communities. The population simply churns more. There are more new incoming people moving in and out, more young people coming of age who are voters for the first time. So there might be a greater need in those places to orient voters and educate them. Here's how you register, here's how you get a ballot, here are the kinds of ID that are needed to vote. But in smaller communities where the population is much more stable, I think there's just less interest in doing that. Again, I think it's viewed as something of a mandate that they just really don't have the capacity to manage.
Are you, in your sense and your expertise, concerned at all about either the policies, practices, or process of elections in Wisconsin becoming more and more partisan?
I am, and I think it's something that people who watch elections closely or are in the field are seeing happening all over the country. This is, there's sort of a good side and bad side to all of this. Over the last 20 years, since the meltdown that happened in Florida back in 2000, elections have become much better. We have better voting machines. We have more secure systems. We have better ways for voters to track their ballots. There's much more voter information. There's more uniformity in the way voters are treated from one place to another. So it's just been a tremendous improvement in the professionalization, standardization, security, other elements of the voting system. But at the same time, there's also been this heightened partisanship about really every aspect of elections. It used to be that Americans were divided about things like maybe redistricting or campaign finance or other aspects of elections. But now it's the small stuff. It's about signatures on absentee ballots or deadlines for requests or what kinds of ID qualify to vote when a person thinks they're confined as a result of the pandemic. These are the minutia that administrators normally would have worried about and policymakers would have tinkered with from time to time, but they become these hot button issues. And that makes it really difficult, I think, for policymakers to deliberate about these issues and study them in a careful and frank way when they know they've got members of their party, the bases of both parties, watching very closely and putting pressure on them. And also party leaders, people like Donald Trump, who's out of office, but still watching what's happening in Wisconsin and would like policymakers in his party to do things that he thinks are the right approach. So I think the heightened partisanship does make it hard for people who are in the community, real stakeholders, to do the kind of boring but serious work that makes elections better from one cycle to the next.
All right, Barry Burden, UW-Madison political science professor and director of the Elections Research Center. Thank you, as always, so much for joining us.
It was great being here. Thanks for having me.
For more from Here and Now in PBS Wisconsin, you can visit pbswisconsin.org. And thank you so much for joining us on Noon Wednesday.